So now we're recording. This is session number 28 of Old Testament survey. We're in the book of 2 Samuel, beginning at chapter 1, right off the bat. 2 Samuel takes us into the rest of the history of David's life. In 1 Samuel, we saw David's rise to prominence after his selection by Samuel. David's fight with Goliath was the biggest thing that ever happened to him in his whole life. Uh, the time from David and Goliath up through Saul's death can be thought of as an kind of an apprenticeship for leadership for David. He began training a group of men who coalesced around him for leadership that would go on into the kingdom of Israel later on. So David is laying foundations during those years. With 2 Samuel, we see David's rise to the actual kingship of Israel. First in Hebron, then in Jerusalem, where he will reign, all told for 40 years. And so the kingdom of David is a high point in the history of Israel. It's a major uh, major development, if you will, the next really major development after the conquest under Joshua. So with David's kingdom, we see Israel rising to a place of some power in the world, particularly in this area. You'll notice as we look at David's life, the enemies of David are the local minor powers. The great powers continue to be on the sideline. We don't hear anything from Egypt. We don't hear anything from Mesopotamia. The Hittites have long been on the sidelines. They're no longer a major people group. And the big powers that are a problem for David are the local circle. Philistines, Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, Amalekites, the Amorites of Syria. Uh, the, we see these local powers surrounding Israel who have always been the problem. And generally speaking, in the Old Testament, when the Bible refers to the nations, it's referring to an inner circle of nations that I just mentioned. Philistines, Lebanon is usually included, Syria, Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, Amalekites, those people groups who are close by. And then there is a farther group of nations, Egypt and North Africa, the rest of the Middle East, including all of Mesopotamia, and Asia Minor, which is the Hittite country in the ancient world, but will later on take on more or less power with various different groups. Those are the areas that the Bible speaks of as the nations or the Gentiles. When the Bible says things like that, it's not usually talking about Canada or Papua New Guinea or the Philippines. The judgments of God later on that come down on quote unquote the nations usually refer to the nations that are close into Israel. And that will make a difference when later on we get to the prophetic literature. But let me share the screen here, and we're going to look at 1 Samuel. Let's see if this can be made to work correctly. And we'll do the presenter view. Oops, no, it didn't work. Oh, I just love it when that happens. I love technology. There are times when it's just exactly what I want. There we go. And other times it just doesn't work. Here we go. We're up and running. So Second Samuel is really easy to divide up. The first 10 chapters of Second Samuel uh, give us some details about David's triumphs. And I'll show you a map here in a couple of slides. All of the territory that David managed to control. He either conquered these places or he put a variety of kings under tribute. And we'll see the list of them. It isn't terribly important for our purposes. David's troubles begin in chapter 11 with the famous incident with Bathsheba. And we'll spend a bit of time developing that whole mess. It's not a pretty story. The appendix to David's life is fascinating on several levels. My favorite part of this story has to do with the men that David trained. So we'll spend some time with them. We'll start off in the first few verses here with, let's see, I'm going to put this over here. And we'll go on to the beginnings of David's triumph. He is introduced again after the death of Saul. This is in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. After the death of Saul, David had returned from striking the Amalekites. David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, there in Ziklag, he was met by a man who had come running all the way from the north. This was quite a run. This is about 100 kilometers to run. It's a good long run over hilly country. So this is obviously somebody who is pretty motivated, really intended to tell Saul something or tell David something. So here he comes, and he came to David, and David said, "Where have you been from?" And he said, "I escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said, "How did it go?" And he answered, "The people fled from battle. Many of the people have fallen and are dead. Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." So David said to the young man, "How do you know this?" And the young man said, "Well, by chance, I happened to be there on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. When he looked behind him, he saw me and called out, and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Who are you?' I said, 'I'm an Amalekite,' which is not a good thing for him to have admitted to David. And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.'" So the Amalekite is claiming something different from what is told us in 1 Samuel 31. 1 Samuel, the account goes that Saul was close pressed. His armor bearer wouldn't kill him, so he leaned on his sword and killed himself. Um, the Amalekite claims that he did the job, uh, and somebody is not being entirely accurate here. Now, it could be that Saul was leaning on his sword but didn't quite die. So there he was. Somehow he'd gotten his spear and was leaning on it, asked for help with the ending of his life. That's possible. Or it could be that the Amalekites simply found Saul and Jonathan dead and wanted to claim the the death of Saul in hopes of getting a reward from David. We don't really know which one of those this is. I suspect the Amalekite was simply lying, but I can't prove that. So the Amalekite says he said, "Kill me," so I killed him. because surely he couldn't live. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. They're thinking that the crown and the other symbols would get him a reward from David. So David took hold of his clothes, he tore his clothes, and everyone there mourned and wept and fasted for Saul and Jonathan. And David said to the young man, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Well, I'm a sojourner, an Amalekite." And David said, "How is it you were not afraid to put your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Ah, there's that phrase again. Since Saul was anointed to be king by an authentic prophet, David's principle was, you can't reach out your hand to kill him. That's the principle. That's what not laying a hand on the Lord's anointed is all about. And David took that to be a serious principle. The fact also that this man is not an Israelite, he's an Amalekite and an enemy of Israel, probably did no good. So David called one of the young men and said, execute him. And he struck him down, and he died. And David said, your blood is on your own head. Okay. Then the rest of this chapter, we get a lament over Saul and Jonathan. This is a classic lament form. It's good stuff. I like this passage because of the poetry. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. So there we have a bit of poetry, and this is obviously David's poetry. And we're going to see a whole bunch of this in the Psalms. We won't spend nearly as much time in the Psalms as I would like to, but this is a little touch of poetry. The Hebrew poetry is different from poetry in other languages, and it is very translatable. Here in English, it works fine. It actually works fine in Italian or in Tagalog or in any of the other languages you'd like to translate into, for reasons that we'll explain later on. Chapter 2, David is anointed king over the tribe of Judah. The southern kingdom was given to David at this point. The Lord said, go up. He said, where shall I go? Well, let's go to Hebron. The photograph in the background here is Hebron. Hebron is in the southern part of the hill country of Judah. It's a classic spot. This is Caleb's inheritance, and it's a classic southern city of Judah. So David went up there with his two wives also, and David brought up his men, and then he takes care of the men who had done the heroic deed of taking the bodies from Bet Shan, the men of Jabesh Gilead. Was a good thing that he did there. At the same time, the son of Saul, whose name is Ishbosheth, is made king over the northern tribes of Israel. Now, this works out because Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 10 northern tribes. And because of that, there was a natural affinity for Saul with the northern tribes and David with the southern tribe. mostly Judah, but Simeon is down there also. And so we typically speak of Judah in the south, but Judah includes Simeon. And then the northern tribes is all of the other tribes, except for the Levites, of course, who didn't have territory. So Ishbosheth is made king of the north. David is made king of the south in Hebron. And that's going to lead to civil war. There's several years of civil war. And here in chapter 2, we see the famous description of the Battle of Gibeon. Gibeon is in the tribal area of Benjamin. It's actually just north of Jerusalem. Uh, and the battle would have taken place around one of the big pools of Gibeon. Ever since the time of Joshua, the Gibeonites were cutters of wood and drawers of water. The big pools at Gibeon, at modern El Jib, allow us to have a look at this actual place. So Abner, son of Ner, and Joab, son of Zeruiah, went down to Gibeon along with their armies. And so those are the two. Abner is the commander of Ishbosheth's army. Joab is the commander of David's armies, and they met together at Gibeon. Something for us to remember is that armies in these times were often closely related. And Abner and Joab knew each other. They were distantly related. They were in peaceful times. They would most likely have been friends. So this was similar to a civil war any place. In the American Civil War, it often happened that generals and even common soldiers on both sides of the lines knew one another and in peacetime had been friends. Well, Joab and Abner certainly knew each other, so they met there and had a parley ahead of time. Uh, and Abner said to Joab, uh, let the young men arise and play before us or compete before us. The the line goes either way, and it means whatever it happens to mean. In this case, it means let them compete in mortal combat, single combat with one another. So Joab said, that's a good idea. And so they numbered 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, and 12 for the servants of David. So 12 each on each of the two tribes. And we're told each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side. So they fell down together. And therefore that place was called Helket Hazarim, which is Gibeon. Okay, so you can imagine my surprise when on one of my trips to Italy, I came home through Germany, and I stopped in the museum, one of several museums in Berlin, because I had heard this is a famous museum and you really shouldn't stop in Berlin without going to this museum. I didn't know what I was going to find there. Uh, the most famous thing is the Temple of Zeus. The Pergamum Museum is in Berlin, and so I went there. But there's also an ancient Near Eastern museum, and I thought, well, I could stop in. I had the day, so I went through the ancient Near Eastern museum in Berlin, and lo and behold, what to my wondering eye should appear, but this relief. This particular relief belongs to the Hittites, comes from a Hittite city in Turkey, and dates to around 1200 BC, about 200 years before this event at Gibeon. But look at these two soldiers. Uh, Neither of them has armor on. They both have long hair. They're holding out their left hands, uh, one with left and one with right, but I'm guessing that it would normally be the same hand on either side. One hand is grabbing the hair of the opponent to hold one another close. And then with the other hand, they have short swords and they're trying to stab each other. It looks like one has succeeded and the other hasn't quite yet. And they're obviously close enough that they're able to do one another serious damage. This would be a terrible way to fight. You're one-handed, no shield, and all you can do is take a whack at one another. Uh, and it's not surprising that David's men and Ishbosheth's men all killed each other doing a fight like this. Uh, this relief demonstrates for us that what we see described here in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel is not unique. This is something that ancient armies apparently did. Uh, and I can't but imagine that this was a really, really terrible thing to do. Anyway, there it is. There's a civil war, and it begins there. It's a long, tough day. The battle was very fierce. After that beginning, and no decision being made from the young men playing before them, Abner and Joab uh, continued to fight, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. That's in verse 17. As they fled, the three sons of Zeruiah, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, were at the battle. Zeruiah, by the way, uh, this is a bit of trivia. It won't be on the final exam. Zeruiah is David's sister. So this is a close-knit family, and these are all people. Joab is what would he be, a nephew? All three of them are nephews of David, so these are people that are related to each other. Then uh, uh, the Asahel pursued Abner. Now Abner is one of Saul's guys, Saul's general, a contemporary of Joab, and thus Asahel also. And Asahel pursued Abner, and he was really quick. And he turned neither to the right nor to the left from following Abner. And Abner looked back and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" And Asahel answered, "You betcha it is. I'm going to get you." That's not in the Hebrew. It's just my translation. And Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or to the left. Seize one of the young men and take his spoil." And Asahel would not turn from following him. And Abner said to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How could I lift up my face before your brother Joab?" We have to remember that these men all knew one another and would have to face one another afterwards. In the modern Near Eastern world, terrorists and the occasional mass murderer who attacks Israeli school kids on buses, that kind of thing, often wear masks because they are known, and if uh, if they're identified, how could their relatives hold up their heads in public anymore? This is one of the major reasons that you'll see people doing uh, doing evil things wearing masks. Now, the other reason that people wear masks is because they're afraid of a coronavirus, but that wasn't the problem in the ancient world. There were viruses, but nobody knew. So maybe they didn't get sick as often because they wore their masks. I don't know. Anyway, Asahel wouldn't turn down, so Abner struck him in the stomach oh my goodness, with the butt of his spear. In other words, instead of the pointy end, he stuck him with the blunt end of his spear, uh, and uh, and the spear came right out the back of him, which would have been a terrible blow. You can just imagine all the internal injuries. The spear came out the back, and he fell there. And the Bible adds unnecessarily, as usual, and he died. And all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still and looked. So, a major traffic jam there on the trail where Asahel had died. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and eventually Abner called out, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that the end will be bitter? How long before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of their brothers?" And Joab responded, "As God lives, if you hadn't spoken, the men would not have given up the pursuit." Uh, so Abner essentially here has conceded defeat, and the civil war is over. And Joab returned from the pursuit, and they gathered. Now, after this, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. David grew stronger. House of Saul grew weaker. Ishbosheth continued this conflict, what modern soldiers would call a war of attrition. We just slowly try to wear one another out. But David's group was obviously going to win this. Eventually, uh, uh, Abner was. I'm not going to tell you this whole story. Abner decided to uh, give up the battle. And uh, uh, he oh, what do they call it when he went over to the other side? What do they call that? He defected. Yeah. So Abner is a defector. Uh, I must be like Joe Biden. I'm losing my marbles ever so slowly, one marble at a time. They kind of drop off the edge, and I hear a thunk. And, they go, oh, okay, that's what it sounds like. And so Abner defected to David, went over to David's side and swore allegiance and all of the rest of that. But Joab didn't believe him. He didn't want to believe him. He didn't believe him. He wasn't interested in believing him. And this latter part of chapter 3, Joab murders Abner. Abner, of course, had killed Joab's brother Asahel, but that wasn't the wrong thing for Abner to do. It was a war. Stuff happens. But Joab refused to forgive him for that. The end of chapter 3, David mourns for Abner. David realized that what happened to Abner should not have happened, that this was a wrong thing. And he mourned Abner. Should Abner die as a fool dies? Verse 33. Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And that's a rebuke against Joab. And yet, David did not fire Joab. Joab is a really interesting character. Joab is going to do a lot of things in 2 Samuel that are apparently pragmatic, not necessarily the ethical or the right thing to do. Joab is the pragmatist, the political pragmatist. He will do whatever is necessary to advance David's position. And if that means doing something genuinely loathsome, He's not above that. He's fine with that. He's a almost pure politician. In the modern world, we'd call this a political hack. In chapter 4, we see the murder of Ishbosheth. When Saul's son Ishbosheth heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed. All Israel was dismayed. And we see the story of Mephibosheth here, who is related all along the way. Mephibosheth is the son of Jonathan. He's a lame boy, and David is going to take good care of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth gets a bad press toward the end of David's life, but it wasn't true. And we're going to run into that. But as this thing is happening, Ishbosheth himself had an arranged demise. He was murdered, his head cut off and brought to David. But David ended up taking the head of Ishbosheth, having that buried with honor in Hebron with Abner. Chapter 5, we see the establishment of David's kingdom in Jerusalem. This photograph is taken in Jerusalem near the Temple Mount, and just an idea of what Jerusalem is like today. You're going to find lots and lots of Muslims in Jerusalem today. The Arabs still control the old city of Jerusalem. But in 1003 BC, actually 1002 and a half BC, but 1003 or so BC, David becomes king over all of Israel at Jerusalem. And the way that happened is that all of the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and they said, "We are bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh. In times past, Saul was king, and you led us in and out. You should be the king of all of Israel." And so the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them and they anointed David as king over Israel. And he was 30 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 40 years. Now, this particular text is accurate. It's confirmed in the Septuagint. It's confirmed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's confirmed in the New Testament. The length of reign of both David and Solomon is established by the very well, and we have no real questions about the length of reign. They both reigned for 40 years. It's traditional that Saul also reigned for 40 years, but frankly, we don't know. Many of us think it was a considerably shorter reign on the order of 10 to 15 years, but none of us can prove that. So, it is what it is. Immediately after that, the king and his men went up to Jerusalem. Now, Hebron is way in the south. Jerusalem is actually not all that much further north. That's about 40 kilometers farther north than Hebron. And people wonder, well, why did the Israelites pick Jerusalem as the central city, as the capital city? The reason for that is that Jerusalem is on the border between the northern 10 tribes and the southern tribes. is right on the border between Judah and Benjamin. Matter of fact, the line that goes between Judah and Benjamin goes right across the Temple Mount. That's the spot. So if you go to the old city of Jerusalem, you'll be walking from Benjamin into Judah uh, as you come from the Damascus gate down toward the Temple Mount. Uh, the location of Jerusalem is obviously well known, and Jerusalem uh, had been occupied as early as 3000 BC that we know of. We have archaeological evidence for a Canaanite and an Amorite and Jebusite occupation of Jerusalem going all the way back to 3000 BC during the early Bronze Age. There's no question about that. The Jebusites were an Amorite group who lived in Jerusalem at this time. The area of Jerusalem that they occupied was actually fairly small. It's a little point of land south of the Temple Mount that we sometimes call the Ophel. It means a tongue. This little point of land is shaped kind of like somebody's tongue, I guess. And this hangs to the south between the Kidron and the Hinnom valleys. And was the earliest fortified location in Jerusalem. It was fortified around the water shaft that goes down to the Kidron Valley at Gihon. So the Gihon Spring is an important little feature of Jerusalem at this point. That was the early water supply for Jerusalem. And as that's the background that we need, so what do we have here? And the Jebusites, who were in Jerusalem at the time, shouted down to David and his men, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking David can't come in here. Okay, that's a kind of insult. Uh, we don't need to worry about you guys getting in here because even our lame and blind could hold this wall against an army like yours. It's like, you guys couldn't fight your way out of a paper bag kind of insult. You guys couldn't even beat an army of blind people. We just shoot you by the smell of you from this distance. Not a nice thing to say. And David responds to the insult by saying, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him go up the water shaft to attack those lame and blind for me." And we're told that that is exactly what happened. The account that's given to us in the Chronicles tells us that Joab did this thing. There's that Joab again. And visualize what Joab actually had to do. I need to show you a cross section of the water shaft of the Jebusites. So I'm going to end this share. Let's see if I can pause the share. Oh, I don't think I can. I've got to resume that, and I've got to stop that, and then I've got to show this one. It's also complex. Okay, whiteboard. Now let me show you how the Jebusite fortress was laid out. This will work. Blue works fine. At a fairly sharp line. And here's the fortress. There's the wall. And there's probably two walls here. And so should have used green for that, but we'll do it anyway. there's a spring that we call the Gihon. Gihon is a word that means gusher, and the water runs out of the Gihon and flows down into the Kedron Valley. Kedron is the name of the brook that runs between Jerusalem. Here's the Jebusites. This is the Jebusite fortress. And this way is the Mount of Olives, Mount Olivet, over that way. And the Kedron Valley runs in between. The Gihon runs out of the side of this hill and into the Kedron Valley. Well, very, very early on, the Canaanites who lived here discovered that there is a cave. The Gihon tends to fill up this cave. From inside the city, they followed cracks underground like that, so that it was possible to go down into the water table and get water during a siege. Outside, rocks and things were piled up and brush to cover it to make it difficult to find the exterior. What Joab apparently did, here's Joab, we've got him, and he's just this little guy. He took his outer garments off, so he's stripped down to just his skivvies, and no armor, no helmet, none of the usual stuff. And he took a sword, most likely a short sword, in his hand that he would have had to carry in between his teeth. He, in the sight of archers on top of the walls, he pulled the rocks out of the way and then jumped into the water. And he swam underwater for a distance of about 50 meters, roughly 50 meters, came up here, climbed this sheer cave. The rope ladders must have been pulled up. He came out at the top, fought off whatever guards were at the top of the water shaft, fought his way along the edge of the wall until he found the gate. He opened the inner gate, he opened the outer gate, which normally took multiple soldiers to do. And at that point, David and his army came up through the open gate and overwhelmed the city of Jerusalem. Now, earlier we've seen that Joab is this pragmatic guy. He does whatever is necessary. If that means murder somebody, he doesn't have a problem with that. And people have wondered, why is it that David puts up with an unethical, pragmatic, difficult, cranky old character like Joab? This is why David put up with Joab. And it's important for us to remember that. Okay, enough of that. I'm going to stop sharing. And we'll go back to chapter, there we go. Back to chapter 5. We'll finish this off. David managed to get inside by going up the water shaft. That's kind of an amazing exploit. David then became greater and greater. Hiram of Tyre sent messengers, and David took concubines. Then we've got David over all of Jerusalem. He begins defeating Philistines. Chapter 6 We see the Ark of the Covenant brought up to Jerusalem. This ends up being a very big production. It comes up from the house of uh, the house of Baljudah. Uh, it was at Kiryat Jearim for a while. And it said up through this place, and they brought the Ark of the Covenant and uh, other elements of the tabernacle finally up to Jerusalem. Along the way, we see the story of Uzzah. David and all the house of Israel were celebrating with harps and tambourines and whatnot. And a priest by the name of Uzzah was walking alongside the ark, which had been placed on an ox cart of all things, and it was getting ready to fall over. So Uzzah put out his hand to prevent the Ark of the Covenant from falling off the cart. Now, those of us who've read Leviticus and Exodus know that the way you pick up the Ark of the Covenant is with a pair of long poles. You don't touch it. You put these two long poles through specially made golden rings, and then four men at least pick up the Ark of the Covenant and carry it that way so that it is absolutely secure. That's the right way to handle the Ark of the Covenant. You don't look in it. You don't pick it up. You don't touch it. You it's a holy thing. So Uzzah forgot that. And he reached out, took hold of it because the oxen were having a little trouble. And the anger of the Lord, verse 7, was kindled against Uzzah. I think that's rather a telling word to have the anger kindled. I really like that. And he struck him down there because of his error, and he died there next to the ark of God. Uzzah was hit by the Zot Fuf event. This is that kind of effect where the fire of God comes down from heaven like lightning, sets fire to Uzzah, burns them all up, leaving a dark spot on the pavement. Uh, it's really kind of sad because Uzzah was not a bad man. He was trying to do the right thing, but he fell short of the perfection that God expects. And that's something that we have to recognize here. Later on, we don't see this happening again. Uh, as this chapter goes on, we've got the affair with David and Michal. Michal, of course, is Saul's daughter. He was one of David's wives. She felt comfortable telling him that he looked stupid dancing before the Lord. That was not a wise thing for Michal to say. Uh, she had then no child by David, which is too bad. Michal is probably a nice girl, but she should probably have held her peace here. Chapter 7 is one of the more important chapters in the Old Testament. Is it now, you ask? And I will say yes. Chapter 7 is uh, the account of the Davidic covenant. Now we've spoken of the Abrahamic covenant, and there are also some other covenants that are important in the Old Testament. A covenant is a contract, and the covenants that we know of in the Old Testament are either conditional or unconditional. A conditional covenant says, if you will do X, then I will do Y. So we make contracts all the time that are conditional. If you make a down payment of such and you make monthly payments of so much, then you may take this car and drive it as though it were your own car, when in fact it belongs to the bank. And at the end of 3 years, the car will be paid off, and then we'll give you title to it. Okay, that's a contract. And if I make my payments, then I can keep my car. That's a conditional contract. And there's a lot of contracts in the Old Testament, covenants in the Old Testament that are like that. If you will keep my statutes and do all these things that I'm telling you to, then it shall go well with you and you will live long in the land that I'm about to give you. A lot of that, the so-called Palestinian covenant, the Mosaic covenant, which is the Old Testament law, is conditional in that way. Blessing is conditioned on obedience to the law. And we see a lot of places in the Old Testament where that's the point. The books of the Kings are an extended story of the conditional blessing that comes with obedience to the law and the curse that results from disobedience. That's what the whole history of Israel after Solomon is really all about. But there are some covenants in the Old Testament that are unconditional. You can tell an unconditional covenant because it doesn't say if X, then Y. It simply says, I will. God says, I will bless you. I will make your name great. I will make you a great nation. I will show you the place that I'm going to give you. God didn't say to Abraham, if you obey me, I will bless you. That comes somewhat later. There's some blessing that's conditioned on obedience even for Abraham. But the basic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, is eternal. The land is eternal. The messianic line is eternal. The kingdom is eternal. These things are not negotiable, and they're things that God has purposed from eternity past to accomplish within his people. The Davidic covenant, the covenant with David that is established here in chapter 7, is another of these unconditional covenants. Let me read the portions that are significant, and I'll tell you what I mean by this unconditional covenant and the elements of it, because it ends up being important for our understanding of biblical prophecy. People always think that biblical prophecy kind of stands on its own, and it really doesn't. Uh, all of the parts of the Bible are connected. One of the most important things that we can do in understanding the Bible is to connect the dots. When we connect the dots to make the big stories that cover the whole Bible, then we're really understanding the theology of the Bible. Biblical theology involves connecting the dots. David's covenant. So here it comes, 7:1. So when the king had lived in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, and that's about all he ever had was a break now and then. The king said to Nathan the prophet, Nathan being one of David's best friends who had gone down to him while he was still at the cave in Adullam. So understand, David and Nathan are good friends, buddies even. These men know one another well. They know what each other is thinking. And the king said to Nathan the prophet, Behold now, I dwell in a house of cedar. The cedar, by the way, had come from Lebanon. Hiram, the king of Tyre, a Phoenician king and a pagan, had made an alliance with David and was providing materials for David's household. Later on, Hiram, who might be the same king, provided materials for the construction of the temple. Uh, so Hiram is a very important character, and the Phoenicians end up being uh, often on allies of David's. Sidon and Tyre are the two major cities in Phoenicia that are still visible. There are Palestinian refugee camps in those places today, but the ancient sites are still there. So I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. Now, what Nathan was thinking, and what David was obviously thinking, was, I dwell in a house of cedar. The Ark of the Covenant is in a tent. And by this time, that tent is roughly 450, 500 maybe years old, not quite 500. It's getting old. Why should I live in a nice place when this ragged, tattered old tent is all that we've got for the Ark of the Covenant? So he's going to build a temple. This, again, is a traditional thing to do. This is the kind of thing that the kings did in the Old Testament. They established themselves as king and then built a temple, a house, for the major gods that they worshiped. This was a very, very common pattern. And we see David following the pattern. He says, I've established my kingdom, I've beat all my enemies, it's time to build a house for God. Nathan, coming from the same culture and with the same background, says, do everything that's in your heart, O king, live forever. But, verse 4, I always love it when the Bible says but, because that tells you that somebody's plans are about to be changed. But the same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Oh, wait here. Nathan is the prophet of God. That means, wait for it here, Nathan is the one who is supposed to be telling David what God says. Now, typically that would involve, if Nathan hadn't been in contact with God anytime recently, that would involve Nathan going off to inquire of the Lord. And that phrase is used all the time in the David narrative. We see David regularly inquiring of the Lord. Shall I do this? Shall I do that? Shall I go against the Philistines? Shall I go to war against these guys? Well, what's going? We see that all the time. And here, David doesn't inquire of the Lord. And David's main prophet, Nathan, didn't bother. And so God revealed himself to Nathan, said, hello, Nathan. I know that you haven't checked in lately, so I've got a word for David. Just take notes here because this may be a little surprising. Thus saith the Lord, go and tell David this. Would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought the people of Israel up out of Egypt to this day. But I've been moving about in a tent for my dwelling, in all the places where I have moved with all the people of Israel. Did I ever speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why haven't you built me a house of cedar? Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David. We'll stop there for a second. God's first message is, when did I ever say, build me a house? I asked you to build me a tabernacle, and Moses saw to it that that was done. I'm perfectly happy in a tabernacle. When did I ever ask for a temple? Now that's actually a fairly important question, because the theology of the tabernacle involves movement. It involves the notion of being temporary in a place rather than permanent in a place forever. The temple is meant to be forever. And yet, very, very interestingly, Solomon built a temple, but it was destroyed by the Babylonians. A new temple was built after, and then in New Testament times was extended by Herod the Great, but it also was destroyed. There is no temple in Jerusalem today. It was never permanent. It was always temporary, because ultimately the only tabernacle that matters is in heaven. And eventually, we will all worship God together around a heavenly tabernacle. And we'll be proud to go to this tent that never wears out. Kind of a neat idea. I like the idea of the heavenly tabernacle. But anyway, God says, I don't need a temple. Who told you to build me a temple? Now, eventually he's going to agree to a temple, but God knows what's going to happen. Now, therefore, tell this to David. I took you from the pasture, from following sheep, for heaven's sakes, that you should be a prince over my people Israel. I've been with you wherever you went. Cut off all your enemies, and I will make you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. Now, that's important. That's similar to God's promise to Abraham, I will bless you and make your name great. After Abraham, David is one of the next greatest names in the Old Testament, and he is the next individual with an unconditional covenant. So this is very important. I will appoint a place for my people Israel. This is verse 10. And will plant them so they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more, and violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly. So this is a promise of peace in the land of Israel. This, of course, is a confirmation of the promise in Genesis, the Abrahamic covenant. I'm going to show you the place. And this is going to be your place. And later on, God says, look to the left and right and north and south, east and west. This is the land that you will dwell in forever, that the people of Israel will dwell in forever, you and your posterity forever and ever. This is the spot. It is called the promised land because of that eternal promise. And what God is promising David here is merely an extension of the eternal Abrahamic promise. This is the land. It is going to be your land forever. And violent men shall afflict them no more from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, we're not through yet, in other words. There's more. The Lord declares to you that the Lord will build you a house. So let's think about that for just a second. God says to David, David, you're a man of war. Because of that, you will not build me a house. Instead, I will build you a house. Now, of course, that house doesn't mean merely his palace. David's palace is already built, and that's not usually the way this word is used. The word house sometimes means a temple. Sometimes it can mean the palace of the king, but David's palace was already built. Here it means the dynasty, the continuing kingdom of David. There will always be a king ready to sit on the throne of David. Your dynasty will continue. Now let's look at that promise of a dynasty. The Lord declares that the Lord will make a house for you. When your days are fulfilled, you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. So there the promise is made and will shortly be fulfilled of the next king in the Davidic line, which will be Solomon. Solomon is interesting because he's not a son of Michael, who is the daughter of Saul. He's not the son of Abigail, who is a really nice, classy lady that we would all be proud to have in the Messianic line. Instead, he's the son of one of David's other wives, who we're going to introduce in just a few chapters. Solomon will be the next in line for the kingdom. And I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name. So there's the promise that David won't build a temple, but God will build a house, a dynasty for David. And this next king in line, Solomon, will build a temple. He shall build a house for my name. And I will establish the throne, that is the authority of rule, for his kingdom forever. So there is something different here. Most human kings hope for a dynasty that lasts for a while. In the northern kingdom of Israel, once we see this split after the time of Solomon, we're going to see, I believe, 9 different dynasties, one after another. Jeroboam had a couple of sons, and none of them were very good. And we have several others along the way. Omri has a dynasty that lasts for several years. We see several different dynasties because they have civil wars and they kill one another and they revolt against one another, and it's not a very pretty sight. But the dynasty of the southern kingdom of Judah after Solomon continues through Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and on through the kings of Judah, all the way down to the Babylonian captivity, when the king of Israel at that time, the king of Judah at that time, is taken off into captivity, and he doesn't die without sons. That Davidic line continues all the way to New Testament times. Both Joseph and Mary are in the Davidic line, not merely the Abrahamic line, but the Davidic line. They both are in the line for the kingship of Israel. So Jesus is the son of Joseph in the line of David and of Mary. Because he is the son of Mary as well, he is lined up to be king in the flesh as well as in the spirit. So this becomes an important promise. The kingly line will continue all the way to the Messiah. Okay, I will raise up your offspring. I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I'll be a father to him. This is Solomon. He shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, which Jesus never did, by the way, so it can't refer to Jesus, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him as I took it from Saul. So this is a reference to Solomon. And verse 16, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. The word forever is a unique Hebrew word. It's in Hebrew, la'olam, into the everlasting, sort of. The Old Testament doesn't really have a word for eternity. This is about as close as it comes. And the promise is that this kingdom of yours will be eternal. In order for the Davidic covenant to be fulfilled, Jesus himself, the dynastic son of David through Joseph and Mary, who is also the Son of God and is therefore eternal, must sit forever on the throne of David. Now, when does that begin? The Bible says that will begin after the judgment of the earth. The judgment of the nations will take place. The church will be taken up to heaven. Eternity will begin with 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, followed by the new heaven and a new earth, and Christ reigning forever in heaven. This is when this is fulfilled. In order for us to understand biblical prophecy, we must get a handle on the Abrahamic promises and the Davidic covenant. These two are the keys that unlock God's long-term plan over over all of the earth. The prophetic outline is given to us here. We'll see that in quite a bit more detail when we get a little further along. So a summary here, the Davidic covenant involves a dynasty, which is the sequence of kings in David's line, the throne, which is the authority to rule, which is ultimately passed on to Messiah, and the eternity of the kingdom. So a dynasty, a throne, and an eternal kingdom. Those three are the key to understanding biblical prophecy. That's why 2 Samuel 7 is such an important chapter. Okay, the rest of this chapter is David's response as a good prayer. And some good stuff going on. In chapters 8 through 10, we see the sequence of David's victories. He's going to beat the Philistines and the Moabites and all kinds of other rights going north and south and east and west. And look at this map. If you take a good close look at this map, you're going to see from the river of Egypt in the south, which is not the Nile, by the way, but the Wadi El Arish, which is pretty close to the modern boundary between Israel and the Sinai. It's a little south of there, but approximately there. All of what is today called Israel. And then farther north, inland from Lebanon, all of Syria, going all the way to the Euphrates River, most of what it is today called Jordan, the Transjordan in the ancient areas. So David's victories were over all of this area. He made a name for himself. The end of chapter 8, we see a list of David's officials, all the important guys who did all of the important work for him. And you'll notice that Benaiah is one of his important guys. We're going to get back to Benaiah. Benaiah goes all the way back to the beginning with David. He is a young man who did very well under David. In chapter 9, we see that the son of Jonathan, Saul's son, so grandson of Saul, is Mephibosheth. This is the lame young man who survived the murder of Ishbosheth. Mephibosheth was, of course, afraid that David would kill him, but Mephibosheth is delivered to David and is treated very kindly. Mephibosheth was taken into David's household. He ate with the king's sons. He was cared for all of the rest of his life, and never left Jerusalem. He was a good guy all during his life, and that's where we're going to. Well, maybe I can. I guess I can do chapter 10. Chapter 10, the Ammonites and the Syrians, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the Ammonites and the Syrians. You'll remember the Ammonites are to the east, the Syrians are to the north. Syria and for that matter Ammon and Moab and Edom will rebel against Israel one time and another, all through the rest of the Old Testament period. So this is never really going to go away. Those are the victories of David. When we come back again on Monday, here we are all unmuted. When we come back again on Monday, we're going to see the troubles that David had. David is a good guy. He did a lot of good things, but it wasn't all good stuff, and it wasn't all stuff that he should have been up to. David made some mistakes, some of them really, really big mistakes, and some of those mistakes are going to come back and haunt him throughout the whole rest of his life. We will see you then on Monday and continue at 2 Samuel chapter 11. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. John.
Good night, Dr. John. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye,
John.
everybody.
Thank you so
Waiting
much.
until he comes back up. Okay, and Oscar will be online for you in about 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, Dr. John.
Bye-bye. Love
Good
you
morning,
guys.
Tom.
Thank you.
Bye, Don.
Ciao,
Hey,
Tom.
good to see you, man. Bye-bye, guys. See you, Mike. Bye, Dolly.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Love you guys.